communication at the University of Gothenburg. He also serves as assistant head of the department with responsibility for research. He's an internationally renowned scholar in the fields of political communication and journalism, and his research covers a wide range of highly topical and central issues, including the media's coverage of politics and society, media trust, knowledge resistance, and media and campaign effects. And he's also a leading expert on the topic of today, mediatization of politics. And we're very excited to hear your insights, Jesper. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let's see if all this works. Can you see the presentation correctly? All right, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here, and I like the initiative of these PolCom Classics. When preparing this, I thought I would give it a little bit of a personal touch and hope that is fine. Most of you might know about my engagement in mediatization theory from my article in 2008, but it actually began way earlier. The first of these publications, Media Logic, Democracy Logic, and the Terms of the Open Society, is actually my bachelor thesis, which was a theoretical exploration into how to understand the logic of the media, the logic of democracy, and what that means for the open society, democracy, that is. I started my PhD in 97, and one of the first reports was about media logic and mediatized politics. And then in 2004, I wrote a book on the mediatized democracy. And as the tradition was in Sweden back then, we usually wrote in Swedish only. So it was only later that I started to write in English. And before I go into that, I want to say that there are two traditions within mediatization research, as some of you might know. We have the institutionalist or institutionalized tradition and the constructivist tradition. And I belong more to the institutionalist tradition, and that is what I will focus on rather than the constructivist. I should also say that there are different views on whether mediatization should be considered a theory or a theoretical framework or a sensitizing concept, and that is something that we can come back to in the discussion. I will talk about it as a theory here because it's easier, but I'm open to whatever thoughts you might have in terms of how to understand it. Mediatization research in the English-speaking literature, at least, really took off in 2008. That was the year when I published my article, 4 Phases of Mediatization. It was also the year when Stig Järvard published his influential article on the mediatization of society, and the year after, Knut Lundby published the edited volume Mediatization, Concept Changes and Consequences. And before that, we don't really see that much thorough reasoning about mediatization. You can see references, but not that much thorough systematic research. But discussion. From my perspective, I came to mediatization research based on different kinds of frustrations. It was a frustration with the vagueness of terms such as mediation or mediatization and media logics, and I will come back to that. It was also a frustration with the lack of middle range theories. In particular, political communication research was and is still very much focused on micro-level processes. But what do these really mean on a larger scale? As much as I do micro-level research myself, I'm more, in a sense, interested in what it all means. And then it's insufficient to stay on the micro level. And I saw that mediatization might be a theory or theoretical framework allowing me to connect micro level processes with meso and macro level processes. And along that line, also focus more with political communication as a process rather than as something that takes place in a very limited period of time. And I also think it was and is important not just to focus on individuals, but also on organizations and institutions. So that's sort of where when I went from publishing in Swedish to publishing in English and developing this framework, it came out of this frustration, and my framework was an attempt to address these, in my view, shortcomings. But what is then mediatization? If we go to the early literature, there are some prominent definitions. One of the most prominent scholars, but not known outside of Sweden, is Kent Asp, who already in 1986 wrote about mediatization as a concept that refers to a political system that is highly influenced by and adjusted to the demands of the mass media in their coverage of politics. So already from the beginning, it was about politics being influenced by, but also adjusting to, the mass media. Another often quoted definition comes from Mussolini and Schulz in their article on different ages of political communication, where they write that mediatization denotes problematic concomitants or consequences of the development of modern mass media. As you can see, that definition doesn't say much about what it actually means, but is very normative. And that is something that is also worth coming back to. Then we have Winfried Schulz, who wrote that mediatization relates to changes associated with communication media and their development. And finally, Stig Arvad, who defined it as the process whereby society to an increasing degree is submitted to or become dependent on the media and the logic. In my view, these are more or less useful definitions. In particular, I like the definition by Kent Asp and Stig Arvad, but they lack, or that was my thinking at the time, they lack specificity. Sorry for that. Making them harder to operationalize and subject to empirical studies. So when I developed my framework, that was what I really wanted to do. And those of you who know my article from 2008 know that I write both about dimensions of mediatization and phases of mediatization. Here I will focus on the dimensions of mediatization because I think those are what really matters. The phases, in hindsight, I should have called the article for dimensions of mediatization rather than for phases, because I think the phases are not necessarily wrong, but there is a lack of systematic research investigating that, and from a theoretical perspective, I think the dimensions matter more and are less fixed in time or space. And these four dimensions are, as you might or might not know, interconnected. The first dimension, I reason, deals with the extent to which people rely on the media as a source of information. And all these dimensions are continuums. So on the one hand, experiences or interpersonal communication might be key sources of information. On the other hand, the media might be. And this is sort of the stepping stone. Without the media being an important source of information, no process of mediatization will ever take off. But it's the second dimension that I think is key, and that is also relevant to reflect upon today when we think about whether there really is a process of mediatization still or not. And the second phase or second dimension deals with the extent to which media is dependent on or independent from political institutions. And my reasoning was that it's only when media are key sources of information and they are mainly independent on political institutions that they can have an influence on politics. Because as long as they are dependent on political institutions, it's not really the media that has the influence, it's politics. So for the media to have an independent influence, they need to be independent. And that leads to the third dimension. The more independent the media are from politics, the more media content will be guided by media logic rather than political logic. And please note here that I write the extent to which media content is guided by media logic. In the first article, I wrote about media content being governed by media logic, but that's one area where I have rephrased or readjusted because I think governed is just a too strong word. And the fourth dimension deals with the extent to which political actors are mainly guided by political or media logic. And in my view, these phases are interconnected. So the most important or prerequisite is that the media are the most important source of information, but it is when media become mainly independent from political institutions that their media content is mainly guided by media logic, and that forces politicians to adapt to or adopt media logic. That is the power of the media, the influence of the media comes on politics, come through media logic becoming more important for political actors in their efforts to influence political communication, influence opinion formation, and so on. So this is the overall framework, the dimensions and mediatization as a process. But of course, this conceptualization leaves a number of questions open. One is the concept of media logic, which was first coined by David Altheide and Robert Snow in 1979. And this is a rather long definition. I was about to say I'm sorry about that, but it's not my fault. According to them, media logic consists of a form of communication, the process through which media present and transmit information. Elements of this form include the various media and the formats used by these media. Format consists in part of how material is organized, the style in which it is presented, the focus or emphasis on particular characteristics of behavior, and the grammar of media communication. Format becomes a framework or a perspective that is used to present as well as interpret phenomena. I don't know about you, but when I read this the first time, I had major problems wrapping my head around what this really means. There are a lot of words, but the definition is quite elusive, if you will. How can you operationalize this? How can you turn it into something that you can actually investigate? So one part of the process of developing mediatization theory was to try to define media logic in a more precise manner. And through that route, I also felt that it needed to be specified more what we mean by media and what we mean by logic. And by media, with media in this context, I am mainly focused on news media in their role as socio-technological organizations and institutions. And I think the institutional aspect is important. News organizations are not just individual media businesses, media organizations. They are part of the same news media institution, insofar as they operate with basically the same logics. They have similar news values, they have similar processes for news values, for editorial productions, and for how news are presented. Of course, there are differences between TV, radio, newspapers, but on a larger, more aggregate level, different media, news media, are highly similar, at least when it comes to news production. Then we have the editorial pages, which is a different thing, but even there, it's kind of similar. across media except for their political viewpoints, but the editorial process is very similar. And logic, in this sense, I think about in terms of the logic of appropriateness, building on Martin Olsen. What is logical is what is considered appropriate in a certain context. So how should you behave as a journalist? How should you behave as a news media? What is expected of you? That is what is creating the logic of different organizations or individuals. We can look at this from our own perspective as academics as well. What is appropriate to behave as a professor or as a university or as a research leader? So logics can be sort of adapted, building on this perspective, to very different contexts. Building further on this, Frank Esser and I tried to specify, and I should say that Frank Esser was the one who did the most important breakthrough in this respect in a chapter in this book that you can see on the side. What is it then that shapes what is considered appropriate within the news media? And in his argumentation, and I buy fully into that, that is shaped in terms of journalistic professionalism, journalistic or media commercialism, and the applied media technologies. So what a news media should do, how they should produce news, how they should present news, comes out of the interaction between journalistic professionalism, journalistic commercialism, and media technologies. And depending on what media we are talking about and what time in a temporal perspective we are talking about, in some cases journalistic professionalism might have a bigger impact. In some cases journalistic commercialism might have a bigger impact in shaping logics, and in sometimes media technologies plays a more important role. And when this was written back in 2011, 2012, then it was still the case that most news media rely on their own platform or the web versions of their offerings, whether it's TV, radio, or newspapers. Since then, of course, Facebook, TikTok, and a number of other platforms have occurred where the media is also an important actor in trying to use this platform to reach out. And then we can see how news media logic becomes more situational depending on the platform. So there might be one news media logic when they present their news on their own platform. But when they present it on TikTok, they do it differently than when they present it on Facebook or on LinkedIn or whatever other social media platform there is. And this suggests that news media logic is not static. It's partly dynamic. It has a core of what it consists of, but its actual manifestation will always be partly situational. And I think that is important. Of course, one could argue that it's still a bit elusive what this means. How do we investigate it? Earlier on, I did some attempts to try to operationalize it further, focusing on the concept of degree of journalistic interventionism as a middle-level concept between media logic that is a bit more abstract and the concrete operational indicators that could be used. And I published one study together with Daniela Dimitrova where we developed these operationalizations or indicators of mediatization and journalistic interventionism in a comparative study between Sweden and the US. And in that we used several indicators. So one was the length of journalistic soundbites. Shorter politician soundbites means that journalists intervene more. they exert greater control over media content. So shrinking length of politicians' soundbites is one indicator of increasing mediatization. The level of journalistic visibility, how visible are journalists as reporters, as person? The reasoning being that the more visible journalists are, the more mediatized the presentation of the news. Who is granted the wrap-up? That is to say, who is getting the final words in news? Is it sources? Is it politicians? Or is it a journalist who wraps up the story saying, altogether this means that, whatever it might be? Reasoning that the more journalists are wrapping up the stories, concluding what the story is about, summing it up, as opposed to letting a source, a politician or some expert having the last word, is an indicator of mediatization. Lip flaps, I'm not sure whether you are familiar with that term, but that basically means having someone pictured, but having a journalist speaking over that person. So if you have a TV news where you can see an moving image of a politician moving his mouth or her mouth, but it's the journalist who is speaking, essentially silencing the person being shown. That we also took as an indicator of journalistic interventionism and higher degree of mediatization. And then we have some concepts that are quite familiar for those of us in political communication and journalism. The framing of politics as a strategic game, as opposed to the framing of politics as issues, as substance. The more politics is framed as a strategic game, the more journalists intervene and the more independent they are in the framing of what the story is about. And hence it functions as an indicator of mediatization. The same goes with the framing of politics as a scandal, insofar as it is the media that has sort of dug up the scandal, who is pushing the scandal. There might, of course, be cases where political opponents do it, and then it's another story. But to the extent that the framing of politics as a scandal comes out of journalistic activity, then it can be seen as an indicator of mediatization. And the final is the prevalence of interpretive journalism as opposed to more descriptive journalism. And again, the more interpretive the journalistic style, the more mediatized the coverage. So coming thus far, we have an overarching framework, we have a sequence, a process, define media logic in different steps from more abstract to more concrete, and finally the indicators. And this was what I wanted the framework to be able to enable us to do, to actually have a theory that links macro level processes to micro level processes, but allow us to test it empirically. To me, theory is nothing you believe in. And I'm not a believer in mediatization in the sense that I want it to be true and I'm going to defend this theory. It's a hypothesis to be tested and confirmed or rejected. But another concept that is important in this context is, of course, political logic, where Frank differed between polity, the institutional and formal frameworks of politics, policy, the policy and decision-based production of politics, and then we have politics, the power and publicity gaining and presentational aspects of politics, reasoning that these three together form what is appropriate for politicians to behave. That is, it forms political logic. Unfortunately here, the same process of breaking it down into operational indicators have not happened, which means that there is somewhat of an imbalance if we want to investigate the extent to which politicians follow political logic or media logic. And if I haven't missed something in the last few years' research, this is still the case, that we don't have the equivalent indicators for political logic as we have for media logic. Another key concept is media influence that I think is important to address. In this theorizing, media influence includes but does not equal media effects. Media effects, as we think about it, is about effects on the individual level, on the micro level, and that is part of it. But media influence is a broader concept, basically referring to all activities and processes that are altered, shaped, or structured by media, or the perceived need of individuals, organizations, or institutions to communicate with or through the media. And this means that media influence includes what is sometimes called self-mediatization. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with that concept, but it came out from a criticism that political actors was often constructed as passive victims of the media in some of the mediatization research. But of course, politicians are nothing but passive, nothing but victims. They are strategic political players trying to make the best use of whatever opportunity structures there are in different contexts. So when politicians self-mediatize, that is something different from when they feel forced in a certain direction because of the power of the media. It's more about how politics actively make use of the media for their own advantage. And that is a kind of influence that is something completely different than media effects as traditionally conceived. But it's still a kind of media influence. If politicians become more conflict-oriented, some in this room have done research on that, because it allows them some leverage in the battle for for public opinion, because they know that media are conflict-oriented. That is a kind of media influence that is hard to capture with the traditional media effects methods, but it's still very important. Another important part of media influence is what is sometimes called anticipatory effects. That is when politicians do something because they anticipate certain reactions from the media. That could be manifested in, for example, then framing something in terms of more incivility or more conflict than they would otherwise do. But it might also include not doing things because of the media. Having talked to politicians in different contexts, I know that sometimes they abstain from doing things because they are afraid that it will cause a backlash in relation to the media. And that might sometimes be more important from a societal perspective than the adaptations they do to the media. But how do we capture that when it's something that doesn't happen? It's not a media effect, but it's certainly media influence. Based on this, when we published our book in 2014, Frank Esser and I, we defined mediatization of politics as a long-term process through which the importance of the media and their spillover effects on political processes, institutions, organizations, and actors have increased. So this definition, I think, still captures a lot of what the early definitions tried to capture, but specifies more clearly that it is a process, and it's not just that the media do things to others, it's that the importance of the media have consequences. And these consequences might be intended or unintended. There might be spillover effects. The character of these consequences might differ. And to the extent that the theory is correct, this manifests in effects on political processes, institutions, organizations, and actors. So it's rather broad. Now, if this is sort of the theoretical framework of mediatization of politics and media logic, some things need to be clarified because there are some misunderstandings. First of all, both media logic and political logic have a situational and partly dynamic character. It's not set in stone. The logic of appropriateness, if we go back to that, means that it also depends on the context, on the situation. So it's not a fixed thing, neither political logic nor media logic. I also want to emphasize that mediatization of politics is not a linear, unidirectional process. It's not ever increasing. Politics might become less mediatized. And it might vary across political actors, organizations, and institutions, and across different dimensions of politics. Having said this, there are a lot of challenges to mediatization theory, and I want to bring up some here. First of all, it's important to note that this perspective on mediatization was largely developed between 2000 and 2012, 13, 40-ish. Since then, a lot of things have changed. We have, most importantly in this context, the rise and increasing importance of social and of political alternative or partisan media. Of course, social media existed before this, but it took some years before social media really started to have an impact. So mediatization theory was mainly developed with mainstream news media in mind. What does that mean when we live in a situation where mainstream news media have become partly deinstitutionalized and the concept of media has become blurred? What do we mean by media today? And while mainstream news media largely function as an institution with specific norms, values, production routines, etc., social media function differently. They function according to their socio-technological affordances, commercialism, and network features, but these differ across different social media, which means that we don't have a social media logic. We have a lot of different social media logics. And of course, since social media have become more important, this suggests that news media logic have lost some of its importance and impact, suggesting that perhaps a decrease in degree of mediatization. We also have political alternative media or partisan media that function less as an institution. They are some kind of media, but they are less institutionalized. And instead of functioning based on professional norms and values, what is partisan media logic is rather shaped by the interaction between political goals and values, commercialism, and applied media technologies. So then we have news media logic, we have a lot of different social media logics, and we might have different partisan media logics. So we can't apply the concept of media logic based on developed as it was from traditional news media to partisan media. But where do we fit partisan media into this? And I think one important concept there, or pair of concept there, is the one developed by Benkler and colleagues in their book on network propaganda, where they differentiate between reality check dynamics and propaganda feedback loops. For the sake of time, I'm not going to dig deeply into this, but the most important part here in this discussion is the second row, what they compete by, where traditional news media compete by journalistic news values, freshness, and the quality of news. Partisan media rather compete by providing partisan consistent and identity confirming news. meaning that the logic of partisan media, political alternative media, might be very, very different. So to sort of wrap up, if we go back to the 4 dimensions and what I talked about earlier, that the dimensions are more important than the faces, this is the original version, where I differentiate between media on the one hand and media logic and politics on the one hand. It doesn't specify what kind of media. And that is not tenable in contemporary media environments. So perhaps it should be revised to specify that this framework is really dealing with the news media. And then the first dimension deals with how important the news media are as a source of information. The second dimension with how independent news media are from political institutions. And the third and fourth about news media logic rather than media logic. Thinking about it in this way, and I'm willing to hear any objections to this. But thinking about this in these terms and revisiting myself in light of this presentation, I think that this part of the framework still has relevance. Not the faces, but if we apply the framework to the news media, it still has relevance, but it's not applicable to other types of media. And this is because if we again go back to the notion that mediatization is a hypothesis, something to be tested, not something to believe in, I think we can see a process where if we take the long-term perspective from the 1960s up until the 2000-ish, we could see in many countries a process of increasing mediatization, where the media became more important as a source of information, became more independent from political institutions. Their content was more guided over time by media logic rather than political logic, and politicians increasingly adapted to media logic or news media logic. But since then, it's more of a fluctuating levels, and I would say we see increasing politicization. But there are huge differences or important differences between different media in different countries. So it's more blending, if you will, of news media logic, political logic, and social media logics influencing politics today. From my perspective, this casts some new lights on normative assumptions within mediatization theory. As noted early on, in much of the literature, mediatization was considered a problem, something problematic from a normative perspective. I think if I would revisit my early writing, it would be visible there as well, although not clearly explicated why mediatization is problematic. And that, of course, depends on what the alternative is. And if the alternative is politicization, then perhaps mediatization is not as bad as some of the writings 10, 15, or 20 years ago suggested. So the future. I was supposed to address the future of mediatization theory as well. I think there are some key questions that needs to be addressed. I think it needs to be thought and discussed whether it should be considered a theory focused on news media solely, or if it could be adapted to apply to media more in general. My own hunch is that it is less useful if we try to adapt it to all kinds of media, and that we should have it as a theory focused on news media, but that is something that needs to be discussed. The same holds for the relationship between news media logic and other media logics. I still think there is much more work to be done in terms of how news media logic and other media logics, social media logics, partisan media logics, how it should be operationalized. And how should, if we think about mediatization and politicization as the two anchor points, how should this relationship be conceptualized and in a way that allows us to address to what extent the media in different countries and the coverage in different countries or in different media within countries is shaped by mediatization on the one hand or politicization on the other hand? I think it's a matter of degree, but we lack the theoretical and methodological tools to properly investigate the extent to which media and media coverage, news media and news media coverage is shaped by mediatization or politicization. So, if the mediatization indeed refers to a long-term process through which the importance of the media and the spillover effects on political processes, institutions, organizations, and actors have increased, then the degree of mediatization should be considered an open and empirical question. And in my reading, the development during the last 10 to 15 years suggests a decreasing level of mediatization, at least in terms of news mediatization, if we could coin that concept in this context. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jesper. It's always a bit weird to not give an applause online, but this was a really nice, inspiring presentation. A lot to do still, feels like, in this field. Let's move on to the Q&A. I saw a hand raised, but I think it disappeared. If someone raised their hand, please raise it again. Yeah, Fiora, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Jesper, for this interesting lecture.